Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Nobody. Today, I want to do a little literature reading for you, and the book I picked today is one of my childhood favorites. This is 1001 Arabian Nights. This is a classic piece of literature. It's extremely old. It's something like 1,000 years old. It's one of the great collections of short stories. It's had an immense influence on your childhood, even if you've never read it, because this is the book that contains so many stories that you've probably actually heard. Things like Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, Aladdin, so many things, and also versions of stories that you probably heard. Arabic versions of fairy tales. You'll read it and you'll be like, oh, that really reminds me of Cinderella. It's like, yeah, you can find a version of that story in a bunch of different cultures. Beauty and the Beast, things like that. But what I want to talk about today is a couple general notes. I want to actually read. I'm I'm going to spoil the book for you. I'm going to read the last chapter because it's actually one of my favorite chapters. Because not everyone realizes there's actually a meta story in this. It's a dramatic story, and it's the story of Shahrazad and Shahryar. Shahrazad, if you know your Disney Aladdin songs, that Scheherazade had 1,000 tales. This is the story of those 1,000 tales, and King Shahryar, and also his brother tangentially comes into it a little bit. Now, the first thing I have to say about this is an old book, and this is from a non-European culture. And so sometimes when people read old books, sometimes when they read books from other cultures, they don't have the kind of literacy that just lets them enter into the story. And that's unfortunate. You really need to just let yourself go into the story because, of course, there's going to be different things. There's different systems of law. Society's different. Economic conditions are different. The environmental conditions are different. But when you read a book like this, what you get out of it, if you just let yourself read it, is wonderful stories that pull you into them, characters that grab you, and it lets you enter into their world. And I always found it delightful. It's such a strange place and wonderful to be pulled into this time, these magical stories. They range over the entire Middle East, all the way across the Mediterranean, over to India. They span a vast area. So there's a lot of variety in them. Um, so the premise of the story, the basic premise of the story, is that there's King Shahryar, and he's married, and his wife cheats on him, and as a result, he kind of goes insane, and he realizes that the women are just out to get him. They're just trying to steal his wealth and his position, betray them. He stops trusting them, and so but he doesn't want to be alone. He can't handle being alone, so he starts marrying women and then executing them. Sort of reminds you of Henry VIII. Now, to a modern reader, you might be like, that guy's nuts. Why don't they just elect a new king? And like I said, it's a story. It's meant to be an exaggerated case. If you don't understand views of royalty at the time, that gets in the way. My biggest advice would just be enter into the stories, invest in the characters, invest in the story Shahrazad tells. She's a wonderful character. It's a little bit of a Beauty and the Beast tale, in that you had a king who had good potential and then went nuts and becomes this beast, and then Shahrazad basically rediscovers and redevelops the prince that's within him. He transforms, and it brings peace and happiness back to the kingdom. So the meta story of this is very much a sort of Beauty and the Beast tale. And in order to understand it, it helps if you understand what the king means to the country, why you can't, in their eyes, just dispose of the king. The king is getting rid of him might bring something worse, and the king is the protector of the country. There's so many things. It's almost like an order of nature. It's like something has gone wrong. Something has been poisoned. Something has gone crazy, and they don't just want to drop it and replace it. You know, they're not like a democracy that reelects something every 4 years, living in a time of perfect stability. You know, the king is the avatar of the state. You know, he is the law. He is the thing that makes their country and their laws exist. Um, and so their concern is what can be done to to fix him, to make him into a good king. And it seems like because of this madness that's come on him, nothing can be done. And in comes Scheherazade. Scheherazade is the daughter of the wazir. The wazir is the king's advisor. And she is extremely clever. She is the wisest woman in the world. You know, she is this limit case, like your, you know, Disney princesses. She's the most beautiful person, or smartest person, or, you know, cleverest, most industrious, most patient, most virtuous. I'm not saying she's all those things. I'm just saying she's that type of limit case. In the same way, the king is a limit case where he's gone crazy to the point where he's not just unhappy with people. In the context of the story, he's killing people. And Scheherazade comes in, and she's generally, you're just married to the king for one night. But she tells him half of a story, and then he decides, well, I kind of want to hear the second half of the story. And he's like, but, you know, okay, we'll put this off one day. And then Scheherazade just keeps doing that. She's clever. She tells him a part of a story, or she says, well, if you like that story too much, it's a shame you're not going to hear the next story because you would have really liked this one. And she kind of tells him just a little bit about it. And then he's interesting because he definitely has a sort of seething madness to him that is compelling. And it just crashes against the rocks of this completely calm and intelligent person and the person of Scheherazade. And bit by bit, you can see stability coming over the kingdom. And so she tells him 1001 stories, which means she tells him stories for 3 years. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump ahead and actually just tell you how their story ends. Because a lot of people know the stories in 1001 Arabian Nights Tales. Not everyone knows the story of 1001 Arabian Nights Tales. Now, I may get a bit silly reading this because I've always found this, ever since I was a child, to be a terribly moving chapter. There's something about it. There's something that reaches down into me and really affects me. But it's wonderful. And this is my version. This is the Geraldine McCaffrin version from the Oxford Illustrated Classics. It's got some wonderful pictures in it. If you can still get a hold of this, which I assume the Oxford Illustrated Classics are still around, this is a great, really accessible version of it. It's a great book. So lots of stories of genies and magic and treasures. So lots of classics. Chapter 35, The Night Empty of All Stories. On the 1000th night after Scheherazade's marriage to King Shahryar of Sasan, night carpeted the floor of day. But Scheherazade did not come to the king's chamber. You have to remember, they've been doing this for 3 years. Every single night, they get together and tell a story. Waiting for her, King Shahryar felt, for the first time in 1000 nights, the black tent of night flapping around his heart. He lay down, thinking to sleep and to reproach his wife in the morning for her lateness. But he found that he was so accustomed to the shadow of beauty falling in the angle of his elbow that he could not sleep with Scheherazade beside him. He tried to read, but found that the words in the book spoke themselves in his head with the voice of Scheherazade, and he longed for her 1000th tale to fill the 1000th night. Let me just introduce this too. This has created a break in the entire relationship. The king and the queen are the parents of the country. And so the civilization, the state, is founded in many ways on the relationship between them, and it's become broken. And as a result, the relationship between men and women, in a way, in the entire country is broken. And so, in a way, this is a story about the reconciliation through the king and queen, things coming back into this order, things coming back into this harmony. They're the king and the queen finding value in each other again. Anyway, I'll continue. Getting up, he went to the door and looked along the corridor, but no shape of Shahrazad fell on his eye. Her little sister Dunyazad was at that moment crossing the passage on her way to her father's room. Dunyazad, go tell the queen, your sister. Tell her to come at once to her rightful place in the king's chamber. Dunyazad took the message to her sister, but Shahrazad returned a message to the king, saying, I will not come, neither will I tell you another story. King Shahryar was shocked, but found momentarily that he could not free the cork which sealed his large temper inside his small body. Ask your sister the queen whether she is ill and cannot come tonight. Dunyazad took this question to Shahrazad, but returned with the same words in her mouth. Tell the king I am not ill, but I will not come, nor will I tell him another story. King Shahryar, terror of Sasan, towered over Dunyazad and said, Say to your sister, my queen, does she not know that I can kill her as I have killed 1,000 wives before her if she refuses to obey me? On trembling legs, Dunyazad ran between the king and his queen, between the queen and her king. My sister, Queen Shahrazad, sends these words. I know full well that the king has the power to kill me, but I will not come, nor will I tell him any more stories. The king let out a cry that shook the dome of his palace and the sky above it, and which shook the hearts of all who heard it, particularly his old wazir and the wazir's little daughter, Dunyazad. For let it be known now, the king's heart ached at the thought of ending that season of his life spent in the shade of Shahrazad's stories. Tell her to prepare herself for the headsman, he shouted at Dunyazad. Then he shut himself in his room, and all night long his feet could be heard crushing the pile of the Turkish carpets and goatskin rugs. In the morning, all the flower patterns were worn from the woolen carpeting of his chamber. At first light, the royal headsman was sharpening his sword feverishly, for he had expected little of it for several hundred nights. The noise scratched its way up to the palace wall and in at the chamber window, where it grated on the king's ears like a dog's claws scratching on marble. Indeed, all the cats of the palace were mewing, all the dogs of the palace were whining, and the palace goat would give no milk that morning. Mysteriously, Shahrazad sent her little sister Dunyazad to sleep outside the king's chamber door, and so it was she who received the message which the king sent in the morning to his wife of 1,000 nights. Ask your sister, my dear wife, if she would be good enough to favor me with the light of her eyes and the sweetness of her voice at whatever time it pleases her to come, but ask her that it should not be too long after the breathing of these words, for I miss her very much. Before the birds had cleared their throats to sing, Shahrazad stood on the threshold of her husband's bedroom. The sight of her dragged on the waters of Shahryar's heart as the moon drags tidily on the seven seas. "O Shahrazad, why did you defy me? Why did you tempt my temper? Why would you not come? And why will you not tell me any more stories?" Oh, excuse me. After you go and see such anger that he's had throughout this whole book, it's very moving to see it come to this. "O Shahryar," said Shahrazad, "I have emptied my mouth of all manners and all gentleness, and I have sent words to you, saying, I will not come, nor will I tell you another story. For such insolence, do I not deserve a sudden death and an unremembered grave?" But the king held his head between his hands and let out a groan which shook the leaves of the trees outside the outer walls of Sasan. He fell on his knees and covered his head with his arms and wept pitifully. Shahrazad shut the chamber door and leaned over the king, stroking his hair. "Oh, my lord, since your soul is in such distress, I can see that I must tell you one more story, but let it be known that I will tell no more until the royal headsman has done his worst and returned home." As you can see, I'm a very emotional person when it comes to stories, and this is one of my favorites. Here is the story of Shahrazad. There was once a king who was deceived by an evil woman and lost all his love for ladies. Now Allah, who invented both man and woman, was sad to see such hatred for women in the fairest of his men. So he sent to the king a lady whose fate it was to love the king despite himself. Now Allah knew that in order for his magic to work on the king, he must send a lady who is in every way cunning. So he sent the daughter of the king's own wazir, and in order to save her life from the hostility of the king's anger, he gave her the art of storytelling. So night after night she saved herself from a cruel death by telling stories which entwined the king in a web of beautiful words, and held his hand from killing her. But alas for the wazir's daughter! When Allah came to fill her heart with the necessary love for the king, his hand slipped. He filled her from head to foot with so much love that it seemed her veins were full of sunshine, and her ears were filled with the continual beating of her own heart. The king's heart was a caged thing, however, and the love of the wazir's daughter beat against the cage bars as weakly as the wings of a bird, and it could not force a way in. Despite the efforts of Allah, the king's heart remained hard, and he loved only the stories he was told, and not the mouth which shaped them. Or that is how it seemed in the eyes and judgment of the wazir's daughter. One day, after 1,000 nights, she found that she was expecting the king's baby, and the unborn child asked questions of the heart above it. "O mother, what kind of man is my father?" The queen's heart said to the unborn baby, "The king is of a kind and gentle disposition, and you will see for yourself if I live long enough for you to be born." "It does not seem to me," said the unborn king to his mother's heart, "that the king can be of gentle and kind disposition if my mother's life is at risk every day of the year. How can you prove to me that he will not hate me when I am born as much as he hates you?" "Hush, my child," said the heart of the wazir's daughter. "If I prove to you that the king is full of love, gentleness, and mercy, will you promise to be a kind prince, beautiful in life and limb, and a faithful believer all the days of your life?" "I will promise to be the fairest prince in all Sasan, in all the Saharan regions of the world," said the little baby. And so the wazir's daughter laid aside the cunning with which Allah had protected her. And in order to test the king's loving, kind, and merciful nature, she laid aside all good manners and sent word to the king, saying, "I will not tell you any more stories." But it caused her great pain to behave so unfriendlily toward her beloved husband. "Now, my husband, Shahryar," said Scheherazade in the king's ear, "this story of mine will not be finished tomorrow night, nor in 2 nights more, nor in 2002 nights, for it is the story of my love for you, which cannot be told in less than a lifetime." Then the king looked up at her and said, "If I spare your life, you will always believe that I only did so because you're expecting our baby." "No, Shahryar, for I beg you not to spare my life or the life of our baby unless you truly love and trust me." Then King Shahryar loved Scheherazade more than Abu al-Hasan loved Pearl Harvest, more than Ala al-Din loved Badr al-Badur, more than Qamar al-Akmar loved Shams al-Nahar. Those are all couples from the stories. Shahryar sent for his wazir. The old man came to the bedchamber, bent almost double with sadness, for he was certain at last that the king's heart was set on beheading Shahrazad. But Shahryar greeted his advisor with 1,001 smiles, and told him to hire immediately 100 scribes, whose pens could double the beauty of spoken words by fixing them to paper. The scribes were asked to write down all the stories Scheherazade had told in the 1,001 nights since her marriage. They were to be written in letters of berry ink on white stained gazelle vellum, with fly leaves of snowy papyrus. The cover was to be of rich morocco, inlaid with silken pictures, and lettered with fused grains of whitest desert sand, with the title, 1001 Arabian Nights. And so it was done. Copies were sent to all the libraries in the kingdom, but Shahryar kept the original manuscript in its priceless cover and placed it in a small cabinet of cedar wood and sandalwood in the bedchamber of the royal palace. The king's wazir lived to see his second daughter, Dunyazad, married to the king's brother, Shah Zaman, whom she made as happy as Scheherazade made Shahryar of Sasan. No small achievement, for Shahryar came to be called Shahryar, the happiest of the happy, Shahryar, the king of all joy. The Prince of Sasan, when he was born, kept his promise by becoming the fairest faced, the proudest prince, the sweetest son, and the most magnificent of men in all the seconds and centuries of Sasan's history. Nevertheless, Shahrazad always believed that there is no one lovelier than all Ind, Sind, China, and the land of the two rivers, or the golden carpeted lands of the Sahara, than her husband Shahryar. It is said that Shahrazad broke her promise to her husband and went back on her word, for sometimes in the velvet-lined silence of the night she could be heard telling more stories to her husband in the warm and loving bedchamber of the royal palace. The kingdoms of Samarkand, Alajam, and Sasan have long since been covered by the drifting sand of drifting time. History does not record what became of the wonderful manuscript entitled 1001 Arabian Nights, and bound in rich Morocco and inlaid with silken pictures and sand-white lettering. Perhaps it was carried off by thieves, or preserved by the prince's son, or sold to merchants who carried it across weary landscapes and strange-colored seas. Perhaps it fell into the hands of foreigners. Allah grant that it fell into the hands of one who values it, for the scribe's craftsmanship, for the words between its rich covers, which tell the love story of Shahrazad and Shahryar of Sasan. So that is the final story, end of the book, and it's great the way it builds to that, the way the king is crazy and angry, and then through these stories he learns things, and Shahrazad is clearly making up all the stories. That's another thing. So she brings up the stories as if they were something that people should know about. And is like, oh, haven't you heard this one? And the king's like, no, I never heard that one. And it's because Shahrazad is clearly just incredibly creative, incredibly inventive, and has the gift of storytelling. She's blessed by Allah with the gift of storytelling. And so they decide to commemorate it forever in this book so that other people can read these stories, read of the adventures, read of the love stories, the terrors, the silly things that happen. And so if you have a chance to read this book, it's a lot of fun. There's many different editions of it. You can pick any of them. They're all pretty fun. It's fun to get a fairly readable one. I like this one. It's very readable. It's readable to kids. Different versions will contain different numbers of stories. Partly it depends on how big and thick they want to make it. But yeah, if you have a chance, check it out. It's a wonderful book. It's one of my favorites, 1001 Arabian Nights.